Okay, I think so. The YouTube stream is up and running, and I think everyone is here. So should we go ahead and get started?
Would you like me to start?
No, I can go ahead and start. All right, sorry, my audio cut out for a second. So hello everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Ellington Margila. Thank you for attending today's teaching event hosted by the Anthropology Department's Ethnographic Field School. Today, we are happy to be joined by Dr. Leni Villagomez Reeves. Dr. Reeves is a former UFW volunteer who attended UC Berkeley and UCSF, then worked at Valley Children's Hospital for many years doing pediatric emergency medicine. She is active in Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, where she co-chairs the National Cuba and Bolivarian Alliance Committee, and with the Passes for Peace Caravan to Cuba and the Saving Lives campaign. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Reeves.
Hi, I am, as Ellington said, Leni Villagomez Reeves. We're going to talk about Cuba and healthcare, focusing on the pandemic and vaccines, but with some explanation of how Cuba came to occupy its unique position in the world. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we're living and meeting on unceded Mono, Nim, and Yokuts land. And because this is almost May 5th, I would also like to honor the mostly indigenous Mexican troops who handed a resounding defeat to the French army, then considered the best in the world 159 years ago in the Battle of Puebla, in the struggle to get yet another colonizing power out of Mexico. And since we're dealing with Cuba, although I'm not a believer, I would like to recognize El Egua, who opens the way. A brief intro. Pretty much what Ellington said. I'm a PEDS emergency physician, a Cuban solidarity activist, among other things. In the normal world, I spend about 2.5 months a year in Cuba where I have close ties. I've been very aware of Cuba since I was about 11 when the revolution triumphed, because I was one of those annoying squirts who reads everything. And in the US press, first the revolutionaries were wonderful, and then all of a sudden they were really, really terrible communists and horrible people, and this aroused my curiosity. When I was in high school, I used to get sent to stay with relatives in Jalapa in Mexico in the summer to keep me out of trouble. That didn't work. And I made frantic efforts one year to get to Cuba from Mexico. The Cubans weren't interested in having random US teenagers running around loose and didn't give me a visa. So I had to go home and finish high school. As was said, like a lot of people my age here in the Valley, my first real experience with the struggle for a better world was with the UFW. I was in the hiring hall in the clinic in Delano and on the boycott in the East Bay. Got to go to Berkeley in the left and to UCSF Medical School during some of the last years of that beautiful lost period when there was low-cost education. I then returned to the Central Valley, did ER medicine at Valley Children's, and got more active with community organizations and with Cuba Solidarity, primarily Pastors for Peace after I retired. IFCO Pastors for Peace conducts an annual caravan to Cuba as a civil disobedience challenge to the immoral US blockade and travel ban, carrying aid as solidarity. It also has a firm commitment to change the laws in the US that attempt to destroy Cuba in retaliation for their successful attempt to maintain their national sovereignty and run their own country. IFCO Pastors for Peace also administers the scholarship program in the School of Medicine in Cuba. You should check this out if you or someone you know needs to become a doctor for your community, but they don't have the money. I'm going to talk for a while, about 30 minutes, and then take questions. There'll be a 5-minute break in between, and during that break, I'll run a tiny portion of the thousands of photos I've taken in Cuba. My connection is through a small mountain telephone company, and bandwidth is a problem. So I'm really pleased that most of you have your videos off, and I hope that I don't have to turn mine off as well. Let me know if this starts sounding truly weird. So let's get started. Cuba's role in international health. First, I'm going to start with some horrible statistics. They're true, but they're not fun. As of April 30th, when I made this slide, the US per million people, because it's always hard to compare, between countries with huge populations and countries with small populations. So per million people, the US had about 98,000 cases accumulated of COVID-19 and about 1,745 deaths per million people. Cuba, for comparison, had about 9,500 cases per million people and 58 deaths per million. The Cuban COVID-19 death rate is about a third of what it is in the US of people who are infected. So we in the US are about 10 times more likely to get COVID-19 and about 30 times more likely to die from it. Going straight to vaccines. Internationally, there are 14 vaccines approved. Only 9 of them are real. The other 5 are, like approved in one country, like Uzbekistan. Those vaccines that have been approved were developed in the US, in Germany, in the United Kingdom, in Russia, India, and China, obviously all large industrial powers. There are also 14 candidate vaccines that have reached phase 3 clinical trials, which is the last stage before approval. And 2 of these are from Cuba, and that's phenomenal because look, the others are from the US, they're from India, Canada, the UK, Australia, Italy, Germany, and again, all large industrial powers. There's no other Latin American countries on this list. There's no other third world countries. There's no other small countries. So how did Cuba do this? Again, Cuba has something that's absolutely unique and without precedent in any other small country. You can take the word Latin American out of there and it would still be true. A robust, innovative pharmaceutical and biotech research sector. And, how did they do this? So they produced these 5 anti-SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, 2 of which are near the end of phase 3 clinical trials, the last step before approval for general use with an emergency license. Cuba's biotech sector is unique. It's entirely state-funded and owned, with the national health system as its first priority and an orientation toward global South-South cooperation and collaboration among research institutions instead of competing for profit. I know this slide is too fuzzy, but I had to show it. The woman in the middle is Dr. Tanya Krombet, one of my heroes. And this also points up the fact that not only in medicine, not only in science, but in the professional sphere and even in the Cuban parliament, there are more than 50% representation of women. This Cuban model of biotech has worked. Cuba has developed some very innovative medications and vaccines, including the world's first meningococcus vaccine, a treatment for a type of non-small cell lung cancer, and a medication to treat diabetic foot ulcers that has been phenomenal. It dramatically reduces the need for amputation. They've also produced human recombinant interferon alpha 2B, which has been used to treat COVID-19 with good results. Cuba's a small country. It's an island in the Caribbean with a population of 11.3 million people. And they've played a really outsized role in international affairs, though. One example is the absolutely critical role that they played in ending apartheid, according to Nelson Mandela, who should know, when Cuba sent the troops requested by Angola when they achieved independence to help defeat the South African invading armies. They also, of course, Cuba occupies permanent space in US electoral politics, and Cuba as well serves as an inspiration for other countries that want to control their own resources and define their own course. They serve as an example that it is possible to resist and it is possible to win. And the value of this model and this example is made even more obvious by the really vigorous, unceasing efforts of the US government to attack Cuba and force changes. Cuba also has a unique role in international health through its medical brigades, specializing in the care of patients in natural disasters and major epidemics. This medical internationalism began many decades ago, but we've been sending international medical brigades just in this year alone, 52 international medical brigades in 33 countries that were overwhelmed by the pandemic. One of these countries was Italy at the start of the pandemic when they were just slammed. One was Mexico, where Cuba has sent about 1,000 health workers. Mexican President López Obrador called Cuban President Díaz-Canel just last April 27th to say thank you. This gentleman looks like he's on his way back from Italy. They applauded them in the streets. In case any of you don't speak Spanish, this says, why are you sending troops to Minneapolis? And the answer is, what do you want us to send? Doctors? We're not Cuba. Cuba's international medical brigades. The last time you might have heard of them was one of two possibilities. One might have been the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, where they were very active in caring for and treating patients. They were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for that effort. They didn't win. The other might be the vilification recently by the US government, claiming that Cuban healthcare workers overseas are a form of human trafficking. I just want to say right now that I know a number of people who are Cuban healthcare workers who have gone on international missions, and this is just like absolutely ridiculous. It's not only voluntary, it's competitive, and people do it for a number of reasons, partly because they're brought up with the idea of international solidarity and idealism, and partly because it's a way for them to get ahead financially. Cuba also has a medical school, the Latin American School of Medicine, that educates students from other countries and then returns them to their home countries to care for underserved populations. About 30,000 doctors from a lot of different countries in the world have graduated so far, including about 200 from the US. And this reverse brain drain kind of is also unique in the world. And again, get in touch with me if you or someone you know is interested, and I can tell you how to get information and how to apply. Back to vaccines. After a brief look at the Latin American School of Medicine, here's a pair of anatomy professors. This is a class in community and environmental medicine. These are first-year students, by the way. The student on the left with his thumb up is from Palestine. The student on the right is from South Africa. The student is from the Gambia. His t-shirt says Students of Science and Conscience. Back to vaccines. Dr. Dudan, by the way, is the Minister of Health. The 5 vaccine candidates are Soberana 1, Soberana 2, Soberana Abdala, and Mambisa. That last one, Mambisa, is a nasal aerosol vaccine. Soberana 2 is a different kind of vaccine from those developed in the US, which, as you probably know, are mRNA vaccines. Soberana is a conjugated vaccine with a fragment of protein spike of SARS-CoV-2 in inactivated form, conjugated with inactivated tetanus toxin, which is very antigenic. It entered phase 3 clinical trials in March. It's close to the conclusion of its vaccine administration phase. They did 44,000 people, but some of them got placebo. Due to the urgency to get people vaccinated, they're going to do another 75,000 trial without a placebo group. Ethically, at this point in Cuba, it's too late to launch new placebo-controlled studies because the numbers of cases of COVID-19 are increasing. So in order to test Soberana 1, which is an unconjugated vaccine with the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 with components of the external capsule of the meningococcus bacteria, to stimulate the immune response. You can see they're piggybacking on their previous vaccine technology. And so that clinical trial is going to compare Soberana 1 with Soberana 2 rather than with placebo. Soberana Plus is being tested as an immune system booster in 2 circumstances, both for 450 post-COVID patients, some of whom were symptomatic and some of whom were just detected in surveillance. And they're also using it as a 3rd dose after 2 doses of Soberana 2 to boost the immune response from about 80%, which is what it is after 2 doses, to close to 100. The Soberana series of vaccines were produced by the Finley Vaccine Institute. Here are some people who got Abdala, which was also went into clinical trials in March, and the part of the 3rd and last dose was completed on May Day. These trials were done in the eastern provinces of Cuba, in Granma, Santiago de Cuba, and Guantanamo provinces. Abdala was designed for a short course over 4 weeks with 3 vaccines. So vaccines on day 0, 14, and 28. And their phase 3 started on March 22nd with 48,000 volunteers, and more than 90% of them completed the whole series of 3 shots. And this vaccine was produced by the Centro de Ingeniería Genética y Biotecnología. So safety has been well established for both these vaccine candidates. And now the follow-up period begins to establish efficacy with comparison of the vaccine and placebo groups, both in terms of positive PCR test results and in terms of anybody who may develop disease symptoms. The results will be ready for publication in June, and then an emergency use license will be applied for, and the mass vaccination campaign will be done really quickly. Hang on half a second, let me get it. It quickly is a good idea. Cubans may say not a minute too soon, because although Cuba had very few infections in all of 2020, when the borders were reopened in November, the numbers began to climb. The Cuban scientists are functioning like scientists in a hurry, but still like scientists, which is, I think, hard for people like me with an ER doc personality, and for a lot of lay people to understand. So when Cuba begins their large-scale production of viruses, the initial run is going to be 100 million doses of vaccine. And that brings us to another aspect of Cuba's role in international health. They've already committed to sharing vaccine with other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean and elsewhere in the world. Iran, Mexico, Jamaica, and other countries have expressed interest, including the African Union, representing all 55 nations in Africa. Cuba will apply a sliding scale to its COVID-19 vaccine exports, just as it does with the services of medical professionals abroad. So what it charges reflects the country's ability to pay, which brings us to vaccine disparities or inequities. On April 9th, the United Nations warned that richer countries had administered 80% of the 700 million shots so far provided globally, while only 0.2% had been administered in low-income countries. High-income countries have cornered the world's supply of vaccines despite the UN's COVAX program. And there's remains a shocking imbalance in the global distribution of vaccines. World Health Organization Director General Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, who's from Ethiopia, pointed out with regard to the vaccine disparities that the world was on the brink of a catastrophic moral failure. In addition to a moral failure, this is going to cause a failure to control the pandemic for everyone. The coronavirus seems to be very good at mutating, producing variants that may be vaccine resistant. So in a globalized world, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. Abby Maxim, president of Oxfam America, said that the US has invested billions of taxpayer dollars into vaccine development, but the world remains at the mercy of a handful of private companies that control where vaccine is produced and distributed. So this inequity is a moral, public health, and economic disaster that threatens to prolong the pandemic around the world. The US embraced vaccine nationalism, funneled billions of public dollars to private pharmaceutical companies, avoided international cooperation. We've got the vaccine. Yes, Big Pharma has the profits. What Pfizer paid to shareholders in the last quarter would vaccinate all of Africa. Please remember that they did a lot of this development with public money. So that brings us to another point about Cuba's vaccine effort, which is that Cuba has had a commercial, economic, and financial blockade imposed by the US for more than 60 years. I'm going to get another hit of water. I'm getting hoarse. Excuse me. And certainly the fact that Cuba is limited in what they can receive. The US can control what Cuba receives in international commerce has influenced the Cuban decision to make a vaccine and not depend on international efforts to sell or distribute vaccine. Again, Cuba can't access equipment, medications, or supplies if the vendor or the transportation company or the insurer of the transportation company has happened, is US owned, has a US subsidiary, does business with the US, has a bank account in the US. Even since the pandemic began, the blockade has been intensified with about 50 new actions just in the past year. Even donations, the guy who started Alibaba, Jack Ma, donated PPE and ventilators and other equipment to a number of countries, including Cuba, and the US prevented that ship from docking in Cuba by threatening the ship owners with confiscating the ship if it ever docked at a U.S. Cuba's country. The U.S. is the world's greatest economic power. That's why the Cubans call it a blockade and not an embargo, because the U.S. can effectively control other countries. Obviously, the impact on the Cuban health sector of this blockade has been enormous. So even as they're sharing medical personnel and expertise with the world, preparing vaccine for international use, they have to deal with the difficulties of the US blockade, blocking access, not only to equipment, supplies, and medication, but also to financing. The US controls the international finance system, both through the World Bank and through the SWIFT system of transfers. I told you, blockade measures continue to be imposed during the pandemic. So let's talk about the vaccines. Soberana means sovereign, as in independent. Cuba felt they needed vaccine sovereignty. People in Cuba are proud of the name and of this achievement. In fact, if you ask a Cuban, what is the greatest achievement of the Cuban Revolution, it's quite probable that they will say national sovereignty or national independence. The answer probably won't be what I might think of, which would be, close to 100% literacy, universal free access to education and healthcare, universal free access to, healthcare at all levels and education at all levels, an infant mortality rate that's lower than that in the US, life expectancy stats that are comparable to those in the US and other first world countries. They probably will not cite as Cuba's largest achievement the fact that Cuba was the first country in the world to eliminate polio or to eliminate mother-child HIV or syphilis transmission, or that Cuba was declared the most sustainably developed country by the Sustainable Development Index. All these achievements are true, but that's, Cubans have suffered a lot to preserve their independence. They're very proud of it, and they feel that's their most important achievement. They're proud of their biotech capacities and confident in those also. They've had more than 3 times the number of volunteers for the clinical trials that they've actually needed. So how did Cuba get there from here? From pre-revolutionary Cuba, a country with really poor health indicators, reflecting very limited access to healthcare, especially for poor and rural people, low literacy levels, little access to education for people who are poor or rural, widespread severe poverty, with a seasonal plantation economy based mostly on sugar, tobacco, and coffee, and with 70% of the arable land and more than that of the sugar industry in foreign US hands. And so now Cuba as a country with universal access to free healthcare, with health indicators comparable to, and in some cases better than those of the US, with 99% literacy, with universal free access to education at all levels, including university and professional school, producing, of course, a highly educated population that's been able to produce scientists, doctors, and other professionals in numbers that have no parallel elsewhere. Well, this is about vaccines, so we don't have really time for even a minimal history of Cuba, but the absolute micro version is that in 1952, Fulgencio Batista canceled elections and became the dictator of Cuba. After a prolonged period of organization and a period of armed struggle, the Cuban Revolution was victorious and came to power in January of 1959. At first, the US government thought that a slightly less corrupt government in Cuba might be a good thing. But right away, the leaders of the Cuban Revolution began to keep their promises to the Cuban people. And so that was not well seen here. In May of 1959, the Agrarian Reform Law nationalized all foreign rural property. They offered compensation to the owners based on the value assigned to that land for tax purposes. They also nationalized other foreign companies and large industries. And in 1961, the US decided that the Cuban Revolution was just a little too much and instituted the US blockade, which we call an embargo. Quick hit of water. After the triumph of the revolution in '59, the new priorities for the revolutionary government were what they called the social commitment, the compromiso social, which is the needs of the people for education, healthcare, housing, and work with dignity. And an essential first step was the literacy campaign, because teaching people to read and write is a revolutionary act. And this began very shortly after the revolution, when thousands of literacy volunteers went out across the country, including into rural areas where no schools or services had ever existed. This is someone I know. She's older than me. She participated in the literacy campaign as a young volunteer. They were carrying the famous lanterns because they were going into areas where there was no electricity. However, it turned out where she was to be too dangerous, because of counter-revolutionary forces still hiding in the hills, too dangerous to give classes at night. And so she said she never lit her lantern after training. The literacy campaign was critically important for the later development of medicine, science, and technology. In 1959, Cuba had about 6,000 doctors concentrated in urban areas, of course. After the revolution, about half of them left, looking for, continued privilege and high income. Now, Cuba has 85,000 doctors. In 1959, the infant mortality rate was 37 per 1,000 live births, but that statistic hides a huge rural-urban disparity. Now it's 4.3, which is better than the US rate of 5.8. However, just so you know, the rate in the US for Black infants is 11.3. And although Cuba defines race quite differently than we do in the US, a substantial part, a huge part of the Cuban population are people who would be considered Black here. So in 1959, there was one rural hospital. Now there are 64. And Cuba currently has a national health system that's free, universally accessible, based on a family practice model of neighborhood doctor and nurse offices with a defined responsibility for primary care and preventive health care in their area, including house calls. There's a well-organized network for higher levels of care with multi-specialty clinics and tertiary care hospitals. Cuba spends between 7 and 10% of its gross domestic product on healthcare. So this is not just about more doctors or more money spent. This is a system of care. By 1961, the Cuban national healthcare system was totally nationalized and socialized, and has evolved over the years to the integrated system now in place, with the base of the family practitioner, the practitioner of Medicina General Integral. There's 13,000 of them. They live in and operate local family practice offices, offering care to the community they're in each caring for a population base of between 1,000 and 1,500 people. Polyclinics are the backup, offering the next level of care, specialty care, and the tertiary level is provided by 12 institutes that give highly specialized care and do research and teaching at that level. So we're just about to Q&A, but they're just, I would like to could we just take on it like a tiny handful of myths about Cuba before we do the Q&A really quickly? One is that there's no churches in Cuba. There's tons of churches in Cuba, all kinds of churches, Catholic churches, Protestants of every kind, Baptists, Seventh-day Adventists, there's a Jewish temple, there's a mosque in Havana. There are also many African-based religions like Regla de Ocha, and there's even the Salvation Army. Another myth is that somehow Cuba is run by Castro. He's dead. His brother has retired long ago from the presidency. The president is Miguel Díaz-Canel Bermúdez. He's not a member of the family of Fidel Castro Ruz. Cuba does have elections. They don't involve political parties. They're nonpartisan elections like school board elections are supposed to be here. And they have a parliamentary system of government. This is a campaign against homophobia poster that says humanity is diversity, Cuban campaign against homophobia. And the reason I took a picture of it was that it was hanging in the office of a Baptist church, which is one of those only in Cuba things. Obviously, we're talking about liberation theology, Baptist. No exit visa is required for Cubans to leave Cuba. There was the Balsero Raptor era that was in the 90s when the collapse of the Soviet Union combined with the intensification of the US blockade to wreck the Cuban economy, and people were going hungry. And the US, in addition to the blockade, imposes a travel ban on Cuba, which is not very rigorously enforced, fortunately. And so instead of believing what I or anyone tells you, I suggest you go see for yourself. Cuba is very safe. It's actually startlingly safe, especially for a woman, how safe even a big city like Havana is, even at night, even in the back of the bus, even in so-called marginal neighborhoods. If you see a group of teenage boys gathered on the corner, you say, "Excuse me," and walk right on through. That took some getting used to. These are the ELAM, Latin American School of Medicine scholarship requirements, but you really need to see this in detail on the Pastors for Peace website. So can we take a break so that I can go do something about my throat, and then we will return. Oh, ways you can get involved. Quick, snap a screenshot. And here's another one. Screenshot, screenshot. Yeah, there you go. So again, I'm going to put up a slideshow for about 5 minutes with no talking, maybe a little bit of music. And then we'll be right back for questions and answers.
Necesitamos tu protección, mamá, para volver a cruzar. Agua salada, salada. Atención, pueblo de Cuba, yo quiero que todos canten mi Yo vengo allá de los montes, por la bendición yo le fui, vengo chapeándolo todo. A enseñarte la verdad, para que nadie te confunda, vengo aclarándolo todo. Mira. Papá viene con dinero y viene con todo. Sí. Es que yo soy así, fuerte como el guacacá. Por eso vengo valiendo, vengo chapeando todo, pero vengo con dinero. Sí. Papá viene como va, de la mano de Guá, viene con tremendo. Ache baoba, ache la ocha, y ache basté. Y ahí yo vengo chapeando, ahí gozando y regalando ache. Seguro que sí. Vamos. Vengo abriendo los caminos de la música cubana, diga, a que siga con dinero. Ese vengo chapeando, gozando y con tremendo H. Mira, vengo dictando sentencia para todo el que comenta, chateando aquí, chateando allá, quitando lo malo, pero dame bajo, ¿ok? Dame bajo. Ahí nada más, vaya. Sí. Vamos. Mira cómo dice, mira cómo vengo. Vengo chapeando, vengo acabando con todo. Porque yo solo soy un bamba.
I'm back.
Are Ellington, Sabdi, or James going to facilitate Q&A? Okay, here we go.
Yeah, so now if anyone has any questions for Dr. Reeves, now would be a great time to ask. Dr. Reeves, I didn't see any in the chat during the
Okay.
presentation.
Live questions are even better.
And if you have a question, feel free to speak up, or you could put it in the chat, whatever you prefer.
I have a question about the vaccine, or I guess multiple vaccines that they're developing. Is it going to be like open source, as in they're going to like provide the knowledge to make the vaccine in other countries, or is it going to be they make it and then provide it or sell it to the other countries?
They're going to both make it and license it for production elsewhere. They already have some production. I don't know if it's, I assume it's going to be open source, and that's a really good question. When I heard them talking about their, at the Biotech Institute, excuse me, talking about their initial years, they said, we used to not even patent our products. And they said, then we discovered that if you didn't own it, you couldn't give it away. In other words, somebody else would patent it. So, yeah, but again, however they do the financial arrangement, the purpose is going to be getting the vaccine out there and not maximizing profit. Are there questions in the chat I should be looking at? Or do you have a follow-up question?
No, thank you. It's just an interesting model that they use.
Yes, there is a question in the chat.
Is there any Asian with connections with Cuba for vaccine distribution? Definitely Vietnam has an interest in the Cuban vaccine. I don't know about other Asian countries. There's probably going to be some kind of cooperation with China, but as you know, China has produced a number of their own vaccines. I don't know if they're going to get involved in production at all. Obviously, they can do production in China on a scale that would be impossible in Cuba.
I have a question. I was reading that Brazil recently blocked purchase of the Sputnik vaccine from Russia. But I was wondering, given Cuba and Russia's relationship, historical relationship, if what vaccines are currently available in Cuba and are being administered. So what are Cuban healthcare workers and others getting beyond what's being trialed within Cuba of the Cuban vaccines?
Cuban healthcare workers are not getting any vaccine beyond what's being trialed. They are using the interferon alpha 2b and some other medications as preventatives, especially as an aerosol. And it's apparently been quite effective because they have not had any healthcare worker deaths. If you're interested, by the way, Cuba is remarkably transparent about what's going on. I mean, the Cuban statistics used to look so great that I kind of wondered, but as I've seen the numbers climb over the last month or so, I realized these numbers are legit. If you go to the Cuban daily newspaper, Granma, there will be every day a report of not only numbers, but details about where people are sick, and for those people who are in ICU, of who they actually are, not patient identification by name, but their age, their former health status and how they're doing. I don't know if that answers your question. But no vaccine other than the trials of the Cuban vaccines. Yeah, Grandma also is published in English. I don't know if they have the same daily health report. It's not hard to learn to read Spanish. Come on, people. I know, I say that. Other questions? If you want to find out more about Pastors for Peace, Jenny Pat just said, I can barely read English, but I suspect that is not true. Yeah. If you want to find out more about IFCO Pastors for Peace, just search Pastors for Peace and go to their website. And that would be a good thing to put up. Other good sources for information are the US-Cuba Normalization Committee, National Network on Cuba, which is made up of a huge number of Cuba solidarity organizations. There have been a couple of, there's a researcher from England, from Scotland really, called Helen Yaffe, who's written a lot about this. There's some articles by her and a whole book that is very, very well worth reading. There was a good segment on Democracy Now! Recently. You all listen to Democracy Now! In the morning, right? There was a good segment about Cuba and healthcare recently. Cuba as a good place to live and work and do research. It's a mixed place to live and work. If you're used to everything being there when you want it, as we are in the US, if we have the money for it, then it can be difficult. I mean, I was in Cuba when the pandemic began in the US, and my husband and son were writing me about the toilet paper shortages here, and people in Cuba were just rolling on the floor because, you know, periodic toilet paper shortages are not uncommon there, but the idea that it would happen here was pretty funny. Permanent positions to people not born in Cuba, citizenship, no. No, Cuba doesn't have dual citizenship. There is one person born outside of Cuba who was actually given Cuban citizenship. His name was Dr. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna, better known as Che. And so, you know, that's a pretty high standard. You can certainly live there, but you can't become, and you can work there, and you can, you know, for example, there's a journalist called Connor Gorey, who's been there since, I think, I don't know, 1990s, no, earlier than that, 1980 something. And you can have a Cuban, you know, permanent resident visa, but they don't need any more scientists or doctors. They're good. They with their homegrown ones. Yeah. So. Questions. I need questions.
One question is, what is it looking like for the caravan this year? And what would people need to do to apply or get ready?
The caravan is going to be complex this year. The dates have not yet been decided. It's not going to be possible to do it in July, as normally happens. People are hoping for October, November. I personally think December is more likely to be realistic. If you want to do a sort of a provisional, yeah, I'm interested, if I can make it, sign up, I just get in touch with me and I'll give you I should have been prepared to put that in the chat, but I wasn't. I'll give you the information of how to get in touch. What I will do is put my email in the chat, and that will make life easier for everybody. That's right. Yeah. So probably December. It will not be possible to go through a third country. And so we will have to fly from Miami to Cuba, which means that we will have to do this as a licensed delegation rather than a civil disobedience challenge, which is a shock. but this is not the normal world. And our Cuban partners have been saying, okay, fine, just come. What is the United States goal in blocking the shipment of PPE to Cuba? What's the purpose of the blockade? The purpose of the blockade is to make the Cuban people suffer enough that they decide to give up. Truly, when the Cuban Revolution was doing the things that pissed off the U.S., and they started thinking about how are we going to deal with this situation. The intelligence was saying the revolution is overwhelmingly popular. Fidel is overwhelmingly popular. There's no real internal counter-revolutionary forces at this point that we're not financing and arming ourselves. And so the only way of getting rid of this bad example or good example, depending on your point of view, and I'm sure you've already figured out mine, the only way of getting rid of this is to cause so much suffering by strangling the Cuban economy that people are willing to give up finally, or that they will turn against their government. I don't know, do you want more answer? It is a good question. It's a great question. I could talk about the blockade for days, but I'd rather not. We got to get rid of it. This is cruel. There's no crueler form of warfare than siege warfare, trying to starve a civilian population into submission.
I'll just piggyback on that too. It's not just medical stuff, it's everything. And
it's everything.
The US also does this to other countries where it's not satisfied with the political leadership or other decisions that are being made. So it's a pretty common historical tactic, but very damaging, very harmful, very deadly. But you can look at all kinds of examples from elsewhere too.
If you search the word US sanctions, you'll find about 30-something countries that are subject to US sanctions. One of the most notable ones is, of course, Venezuela, where things were going pretty well. At the same time that Obama instituted diplomatic relations with Cuba, he instituted economic sanctions on Venezuela with the intent of wrecking their economy. And it's been pretty successful as an economy wrecking strategy. Obviously, a nation that basically produces and exports oil as the whole basis of its economy is very subject to economic and financial embargoes and blockades.
Any last questions before we shift into game show mode?
Game show mode.
Yeah. We really appreciate you coming, Dr. Reeves. I hope that when I retire, I get to do cool stuff like you too.
You already do cool stuff, but I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Hopefully at some point you will not be too busy and you will get to come on the caravan. And again, it's once you've made a few connections, once you've met a few people, then you can go to Cuba on your own and expand outward from there. It's a great place to visit. I'm not sure it's a great place to be a tourist if you're interested in something more than just, sun, fun, and rum, because that's what tourism is set up for. For me, it's like this fantasy New York type paradise, there's, or what, pre-pandemic, there's everything going on. There's plays, there's concerts, there's literary events, and by my standards, they're all incredibly inexpensive. You can take, as I mentioned, the bus anywhere in the city at any time of day or night, and just bop around doing stuff. I live a pretty quiet rural life in the US. And so I go to Cuba and get my culture fix on, as well as getting a look at a society where, you know, merciless corporate capitalism is not the way things are done. It's pretty nice.
We've had one of our students did study abroad there, not through the caravan, but through a program that's linked into the CSU system. So there's different ways to go to Cuba through the caravan or through a study abroad that I think is still active, although, you know, I don't know pandemic wise, but
Yeah.
Mary had another question. If the World Health Organization is in support of Cuba's vaccines, considering their COVAX initiative to make vaccinations more equitable.
I don't know the World Health positions, a World Health Organization's position on the Cuban vaccine efforts. I know Cuba's position with regard to the World Health Organization's COVAX. They say we totally support it, but we don't totally believe in it. You know, we don't totally believe that this is going to get the poor countries of the world vaccinated. Just as a provocative question, don't you think it's interesting that the US pulled out of the World Health Organization just at the time when a doctor from Africa became the first African Director General? However, we're rejoining now, so that's good.
We're on the cusp of right before a pandemic too.
Yes, there's no doubt about that. There's no doubt. Yeah. Even, you know, all the countries that were doing well initially, you know, things are starting to come a little loose, and that's terrifying. My older son lives in Thailand, which had the spread of community infection absolutely under control for a long time, and now it no longer is, and they're back in lockdown.
Other questions?
If there's no more questions, I'd like to thank you for the great presentation and all the great information you have given us.
Thank you. And yes, there are so many ways to go to Cuba. You can go legally as well as illegal. Yeah, it both works.
That's great. Okay.
So go ahead, Sabdi.
You can go. I was gonna do the Kahoot.
So we have a little kind of game show quiz to see who's paying attention, and there's up to 3 DoorDash certificates up for grabs. And our winner from last week is here. I guess she's hungry and wants more of everything. Vaccine information, our biggest internet follower, Marissa Moline. Thank you for coming again, Marissa. And then all of the students in the ethnographic field school are also eligible for this, except Sabdi. Sorry, Sabdi. And go ahead.
They ate my ice cream once. We never got it. So I don't like them. Okay. There's a total of 7 questions, and we will use the chat to let you know if you have won, and where we will send you the voucher. Okay, let's begin with screen share. So you can like log into Kahoot 8 and input the pin. Can you see it? Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, we will just wait for people to log in. Sorry you can't see me. I'm at work and I'm in my car, so I don't want people to see my car. Okay. Is anyone missing?
This time they all picked pseudonyms, so
No one has a real name. Okay, we will proceed then. Okay, ready. So how many US doctors have graduated from Elam? Okay, perfect. It was 30, what is it? Yeah, it was 200. Can't see with this. Let me move your faces. Okay, next. Good job, Snowy Koala. Okay, true or false question. Since 1961, Cuba cannot access equipment, medications, or supplies if the vendor is US owned. True or false? Okay, good job. Next. Still up there, good. Cuba has sent over how many health workers to 52 international medical brigades to 39 countries in the past years? Okay. Okay, good job. 3,700. Oh, super gazelle went up. Worldwide, there are 14 candidate vaccines. How many are from Cuba? Okay, it was 2. And next question, true or false? In the US, are we more likely to get COVID? Okay, yes, it was true. As of December 2020, Cuba had registered and initiated trials for the 4 COVID vaccines. Which ones are they? There's multiple answers. Yeah, it was all of them. Okay, going up. Last one. Why are Cuba's COVID-19 and general health indicators better than those in the US? This one's also multiple. Yeah, so Cuba has more than 3 times the medical doctors per 100,000 inhabitants, and medical students and staff connect individuals on possible early symptoms. And now to see who the winners are. Clever Pound on 3rd place. Great Pound for 2nd. And 3rd place. Good job. And if we don't have your emails, can you 3 put your emails on the chat so we can send you your vouchers, please? And congrats to all of the winners.
Okay, Prairie Panther and Clever Panda. Marissa, all right. And Kalani. Very good.
Stop sharing.
That concludes our second teach-in. Thank you again, Dr. Reeves. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Marissa. Dr. Bond checked in for a bit too. It was good to see her. For my students, we will see you again the day of the final, but there's going to be a little bit of paperwork on Wednesday, but we won't meet this Wednesday. We'll meet the day of the final. All right.